Commentary writer, and Marc Thiessen, American Enterprise Institute scholar and Fox News contributor. So, Tom, let me start with sort of the big opening question here tonight. There's obviously a lot of focus on what's going on with the Russia investigation and the president's decision not to sit down with Vladimir Putin here. But when you look ultimately at the military expansionism of China and the way that they are trying to basically, clean our clock in every possible category in the coming decades, this is really so central, I think, to what the president's legacy will really and ultimately be about.
I think it absolutely will. I mean, the challenge from Russia is a Russia that is in decline, but a Russia that is capable in terms of various spheres. But I also think that when you look at China in terms of the global economic order that it wants to establish, and I think that's important to note, displacing the American rules-based order and replacing it with one that is feudal mercantilism, with Beijing as the center, and then on the second step, the imperial strategy in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, to try and make all those other nations there have to salute essentially Beijing. That showdown is critical, and President Trump, I think, gets very high grades so far in terms of challenging the Chinese in ways that I don't think they would have expected when he first entered office.
Marc, what do you expect this weekend from this meeting?
I expect that Donald Trump is exactly where he is, where he said coming out of the White House today, which is if he gets a deal, if the Chinese want a deal, that's great. If not, he's very happy where he is. I mean, I think Trump has all the leverage going into this meeting for two reasons. Number one, the U.S. economy is booming, whereas China's is stagnating. They've had the worst economic growth this year since 2009. And second of all, the Chinese took their shot at Donald Trump this year. If you recall, after he put his first sanctions down on China, they retaliated very smartly. What they did was they went after Trump voters. They targeted soybeans. 90% of they're the largest soybean importer of the United States, and 90% of the soybeans come from states that voted for Donald Trump. So they were targeting states like North Dakota and Indiana and Missouri, hoping to help Trump's opponents and then maybe have him lose the Senate over these tariffs. And what happened was the opposite. Claire McCaskill lost, Joe Donnelly lost, and Heitkamp lost in North Dakota, and so that play failed. Trump won all of the rural areas in the House. Where his losses were in the suburbs. So the Chinese took their kill shot to try and go after him, and it failed. So what that means is going in, Trump really doesn't mind the sanctions because the Trump voters in those rural states that were depending on China trade backed him in the last election and gave him a mandate to get tough with Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, what fascinates me is that we've been talking about this issue with China for decades. And in terms of having the fortitude to stand up to them, we really have never actually done it. There's an interesting conversation that was outlined in a very interesting Wall Street Journal piece today about the relationship and the back and forth on these deals, and Steve Mnuchin's efforts and Wilbur Ross's efforts to kind of create a negotiating platform that would work. And one of the Chinese advisors told a group of U.S. executives, "We understand the U.S. better than the other way around, and we are willing to endure far more pain without conceding." Tom, do you think that they may have met their match in President Trump or not?
Well, I think they have to a degree, but President Trump has to keep up with this. What the Chinese will do is try and offer some concessions and then break out of them over the following months and years. And so the key for the United States, I think that is absolutely right, that the Chinese play a very long game here. But the key for President Trump is to protect the keystone strengths of American power, which is the rule of law, based international order. Vietnam now loves the United States because the Chinese try and play them. Intellectual property, those high-tech companies that will create the jobs for the growing economy around the world. Protect that, and then in the ultimate long-term interest of the United States, to trust that China's economic model of authoritarianism, of very poor people in the rural areas, of a middle class that is denied freedom, of a Xi Jinping who likes to think he knows rather than the free market best about economic investment. Trust that America will win out, because that's ultimately what won the Cold War, and it will win this Cold War as well.
I mean, you look at the battle over GM. There's also a piece in this story that talks about how the Chinese leadership went around to all the American companies that have businesses there and said, you have to stay with us. You have to stay here in China. We're going to continue to give you advantages if you choose to do that, Marc. That's the on-the-ground battle with these companies. And GM basically made a pretty clear decision this week.
Yeah, they did. And look, Donald Trump has to be tough about that, because the reality is that, and they also do the same thing, quite frankly, with intellectual property, where if you want to do business in the Chinese market, they bring you in and then they make you hand over your intellectual property. I mean, the reality is that, look, the trade wars with the European Union and with Canada, those are wars of choice. Those are we can debate whether or not it's smart to impose sanctions and get into a trade battle with our allies. But China is an economic predator, and I think most people on the left, right, and center, whether they agree with or disagree with how Donald Trump is handling this, recognize that China is a predator country that is stealing our intellectual property, that is rigging the rules of the game, that is imposing massive non-tariff barriers on U.S. economic opportunity in the country, including massive subsidies from the People's Liberation Army and the government into all sorts of sectors where the U.S. can't compete. And so the only way that's not going to get settled through the WTO. And so Donald Trump is saying, I'm going to impose tariffs on you and make it hurt, and that's the only way that we're going to get through to China and make them change their ways.
Well, watching these two head-to-head is fascinating. We remember the Mar-a-Lago dinner, during which the president leaned over at one point and said, by the way, I just sent 50-something missiles into Syria, and here's your cake for dessert. So we'll see what happens in the Buenos Aires. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Great to see both of you tonight. So still ahead this evening, as promised.